Hi, I'm Valerie Eaton, and today we're presenting to you answers from several of the candidates that are vying for the CD17 seat this year. I will present today answers as it relates to youth. Up next, what you'll hear is a question asked by our chair of our youth committee, Nat Leger Wilson, and we will have our co-chair, Ridvan Foxhall, ask a very important question as it relates to our youth.
My concern is, as a youth advocate, is for young adults between 13 to 25 getting assistance for mental health care services. Teachers are overwhelmed in the schools, and mental health education, I believe, should be as mandatory as CPR. So, like, a lack of proper mental health translates into bullying, loneliness, social isolation, things like that, sort of inadequate coping mechanisms even to deal with the sort of situations that we're in right now. So my question is, how would you make mental health awareness mandatory in schools, even for teachers who, when I speak to my youth, could use some training in the way that they speak to them, or the way that they advocate for them, or the way that they teach, or the way that they respond. And it really, with them being direct care workers to our youth, it matters how they're raised. And I think it's really, really important because these kids take these things home. So what do you propose we could do to kind of make that sort of mandatory in schools? Okay, my next follow-up, do you have federal friends that you're connected with when and if you get elected
That's
to
a great
office?
question, because I've dealt with being bullied in school. I grew up in Sleepy Hollow, and I got into a really bad incident because a bully kept bothering me, and that impacted me mentally. And it was a very tough experience. And I would tell you, I was at a disadvantage as far as resolving the issue because I'm African American, and I did not receive any mental health services as a result of that experience. I think the problem with this situation, I would tell you, first and foremost, the government is not that all that good when it comes to providing mental health. We could do a lot better. I'm a veteran too, and I see that this is a big struggle for us when we come out of war zones. So, if they're struggling with that, they're going to definitely somewhat struggle with this issue involving mental health in youth. But I think with this issue, this definitely needs more of a voice on a federal level. We need an elected official to voice this concern, give it empowerment, be able to raise money, as well as try to secure enough federal funding to empower organizations like the NAACP to ensure that these programs exist in our communities. So it's a matter of voicing it, making sure that it goes national, and then also empowering those nonprofits that are already doing the work out there to give them more money, more support or resources to help those young people that are going through these issues. Oh, of course, I did.
Okay.
I've had a lot of work in Washington, D.C. I've worked at many think tanks, and also I actually worked on diversity on the Hill. And by the way, I'm telling you this right now, diversity is a big problem in Congress. So, that was a big effort that I worked on. Especially, I also worked on diversity issues in national security agencies like DOD, State Department, USAID, and intelligence community. And the way I did that, I actually recognized Blacks, Latinos, and Asians who have the background and who have the skill sets to serve in these agencies. But in the way I did that, I promoted their work. So, and many of them responded. So, but we have a long way to go. But absolutely, I have lots of connections.
This is something I'm very passionate about. I chair the Mental Health Committee in the New York State Senate. That's something our leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, appointed me to. And I've been on the Mental Health Committee my 10 years in the Senate. And to me, this is one of the biggest issues of our time. I know when Elizabeth was asking me the question about with education disparity, I think, we're talking about technology and financial education, that's important. But I think even on top of that is mental health, and that we need the funding to make sure we have mental health professionals in our schools. And also that we could teach our kids how to read and write, but if we don't teach them about their own brain, we're doing them a major disservice. we have approximately 130 Americans that commit suicide every year in the United States. This year, I passed legislation because I worked with Dr. Lindsay out of NYU. He found really disturbing data that showed that Black youth suicide was on the rise. We're talking about children. We're talking about like kids as old as 6 years old that I just couldn't believe. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. And it's just, you know, you can't even fathom that. But he showed me the data and he showed me what was going on. And we saw that there's a disparity here. And we've seen suicide rise in every demographic, but it was very startling with Black youth that this was happening. So we were able to pass legislation this year with the help of Dr. Lindsay from the McSilver Institute at NYU to have this legislation of this advisory committee that will be working to work on this issue. In addition to that, another piece of legislation I passed, it's the Suicide Prevention Act of 2019. And basically what that does is it really meets the issue of the cultural competency, that we know that suicide and mental health is something that, you know, no one really likes to talk about. But even in different cultures, it's even harder to talk about. And how you get that information and how you get suicide prevention practices, we have to meet people where they are. And New York State, you know, we're 19.5 million people, every culture, every language. And, you know, I've seen it in my Senate district where we have very diverse cultures that you have to penetrate that. And me going there and talking the way I talk about is not going to resonate with people, you know, not resonate with everyone. And so we have to be able to do that. So that's something extremely important. I think we have to fight the stigma of mental illness head on. One of the other things that I was able to pass a couple years ago is the Mental Health Stigma Fund Tax Checkoff. So basically on your income taxes, and they've been pushed back to July 15th, so you still have an opportunity. When you fill out your income taxes, you could check off on this box on the bottom to make a tax deduction contribution to a fund that fights the mental health stigma. Another important piece that we need to do is I would like to see a 3-digit hotline for mental health and suicide prevention. Right now, we have a 10-digit suicide hotline. It's a national hotline. New York State, we run that hotline. We have professionals that are there to pick up the phones. In fact, in New York, we actually have the lowest suicide rate per capita in the nation. And I think that's for a multitude of reasons. Not to say that we're doing an amazing job, but it is showing that we are doing programs and we are still above many other states in this nation. Why we need a federal response. So we need a 3-digit hotline. And the FCC did a report. They cleared the way for 988. And in fact, right before the coronavirus basically shut everything down, I was down in Washington at the FCC's headquarters talking to their leadership about how we need to implement the 988 program immediately. And I even introduced legislation in New York State to require the Public Service Commission to flip the switch and allow that to be accessed immediately. Because we don't have to recreate the wheel. We already have the professionals on the phones that can answer the phones. But people don't know that number. They don't know they can call it. And by calling 211 or an information hotline, that doesn't work. You got to get people right away. So that's why I introduced that legislation so that we can just flip the switch and we can allow New York to be up and running. And when I'm in the House, I want to see this nationwide because whether you grow up in Peekskill or in Pittsburgh or wherever it is that you know 988 is who you call when you're in crisis, and it helps fight the stigma that just like we have 911, we have 988, and this is something that you just know, and that you know that this is the number that you call. So there's many issues that we can do, but I think these are just a few of them. And the funding in our schools is critical, that this needs to be a top priority to have the right amount of counselors, to have the right amount of mental health professionals, and also have a robust curriculum around teaching emotional intelligence and knowing how to deal with that. And I think that's one of the biggest issues we have in society today. I really believe that. And so I really thank you for asking that question, because I think it's overlooked way too often. And it is one of the big problems in society that gets swept under the rug and just has a ripple effect and affects so many other things. If you're not feeling good about yourself, you can't learn. It leads to so many other problems. So, and it's really something that if you get in, and particularly with a young person that's having a problem, and you can address that early, I mean, that makes the world a difference and changes the trajectory of their life.
My biggest, the question that I have is, this concern, in our system to see the inherent worth of all children, particularly Black children, where there's a lot of implicit, sometimes often implicit, but sometimes explicit bias against Black and brown children. And so the question is, and that ripples across our educational system through the carceral system and our social welfare and foster care system, and even our healthcare system, where, the backlash that affects our children, which is why we have this, school to prison pipeline, because there's this inherent and implicit as well as explicit bias against our children because of the inability to see their true and inherent value. So how would you, make sure that throughout these different systems that our children are protected and their welfare, that we start to change that mindset and we put their welfare in the front
to address those issues?
I mean, I think, so if I'm lucky enough to get into Congress, which I plan to be lucky enough, also working hard to get into Congress, what I would like to do is, as I mentioned, put money into early childhood education first and foremost, because I think that's where, again, all the studies have shown if you put money into early childhood education, you're increasing the chances that that kid will finish high school, will get a job, or go on to college or vocational school and won't get into trouble with the law, regardless of what's happening at home or otherwise, right? So early childhood education is fundamental. We have to put more money into it, and also into after-school programs. Like kids who want the opportunity, parents need help also, obviously, they need a safe place for their children to be. We've also shown that that's very successful. Those are important things. I also think paying teachers more, and if I could wave my magic wand, I would also do something about the way that ultimately school systems get funded, because somewhere along the way in America, and I'm not a historian on school education, but somewhere along the way we decided that the best way to fund public schools would be using property taxes. And if I had my way, I would re-examine that. I understand that probably as a freshman member of Congress, that's going to be a little ambitious. So I'll just start by funding the programs I mentioned. And then when you get into past high school, we need to make vocational programs affordable and accessible for young people. We need to make college more affordable and accessible. And that means, first of all, putting more money into community colleges. So, Westchester Community College, Rockland Community College, And then we need to help the kids get more opportunities to get into private colleges if they want to, increasing the money that goes into Pell Grants, increasing the qualifications. I sit on a college board. It's the one that I went to. I had no business going there. My mom did work 3 jobs for me to even be able to pay part of it. And then I had student loans for 20 years after that I paid off with the help of the student government, but the federal government. But what I'm sitting on the board now, and what I realize is we need more students to have more access to Pell Grants. But we also need to bring down the cost of college, which is a huge problem that I don't even have the single answer to. And we need to also make sure that student loans, if they come out with debt, there needs to be strict laws on the books about the interest that you would pay on those loans, because that's something that seems to have changed since I was bearing a loan, a college loan, that the rates of the interest that young adults have to carry today is a lot higher. So that's probably a too long answer to your question, but thanks for asking.
It is, I think, a question of the perspective of the person that you want representing you in Congress. I think we need more people who understand that discrimination exists. And frankly, I think it's helpful to know, to have people in Congress who know what it feels like to be discriminated against, because those lived experiences inform your understanding of the dynamic on the ground. And also, frankly, I think it informs how hard people fight, especially when the doors are closed in the halls of Congress and your constituents can't see what you're doing. I have been a victim of discrimination. Certainly my parents and my grandparents have gotten it worse than I ever got it. But just sort of it's powerful for there to be low expectations of young Black and brown kids, especially young boys, frankly. We know that in the educational system, young Black boys are so much more likely to be misdiagnosed with having ADD or ADHD, and diverted into our special education system, and unfortunately deprived of critical educational resources, and then opportunities. And so, and I know that from personal experience. When I was young growing up, I didn't always obey the teacher. And the proposed solution from people in my school district, some administrators in my school district, was, oh, well, maybe he has ADD or ADHD. And my parents stepped in, and other members of my community, and they said, well, on what basis would you make that claim? And so they kept me from being put in a special education class. And then I went on to graduate at the top of my class and went to Stanford University and Harvard Law School and the like, and now I'm running for Congress. But it just goes to show you that if you don't, that there are certain expectations and assumptions, and they're not always malicious. A lot of people don't know that they have these latent biases that impact the kind of assumptions that they make about people in our society. So I think we have to make sure that we are being vigilant, getting people in office who understand that exists in our society, also requiring data collection on a number of agencies and nonprofits that are getting federal and state funding, and so that we can start to see some of these disparities in the ways that members of our community are being served, opportunities that are being provided to them. Maybe it's in the employment context. And then you start to see patterns, and then you can, interrogate that and look into that further and make sure that everyone, regardless of their race, is being treated fairly in our society. Those are it. And of course, making sure that you have a team of people. If I'm hiring people, for example, to be on my staff as a member of Congress, I want to make sure that people on my team understand these dynamics and are similarly invested in making sure that they no longer exist. And I'm going to be working towards that. So I think it's about perspective and also about accountability.
Yeah, I'll say 3 things on that. One, I'm glad you asked the question because, my mom set a great example. My mom started out, she had a legal training, but her legal career, first of all, I was an accident. So I was born when she was in the middle of her first year of law school, I think. And so she had to interrupt her legal training to have me in my first couple years. My grandpa watched me, which is why one of my commercials focuses on my grandpa. He was my first best friend and babysitter. But my mom eventually got her law degree, and then her career got cut short a second time because my brother has special needs. And so from the earliest point, she realized she needed to be an advocate for him to get him the help he needed in school. And he did BOCES and he did a lot of other things. And he graduated in his own special way from Horace Greeley High School, the public school in Chappaqua, through the hard work of my mom. Once that happened, she, though, had picked up a lot of skills. And so she became, you used the word advocate, I think, or advocacy at one point. She worked for something called student advocacy in Elmsford, where she used her training to represent kids, primarily children of color in Yonkers and Elmsford and other places, in school district hearings to fight for them not to be suspended and expelled, to be given another chance, particularly when they had some other set of issues going on that weren't really best addressed through discipline, but maybe through other things, like what's going on at home, what's going on with special ed and learning disabilities, what's going on emotionally. And so my own mom, I'm very proud to say, was a longtime representative and advocate for those exact kids that you're talking about and that you have in mind. So I get the problem. That's one. Two, unconscious bias. I think, and having seen this in the Justice Department myself, most people almost everywhere are good people and not racist. There are obviously some exceptions to people who are explicitly looking to target people based on their race, their religion, their ethnicity, whatever it is. I'm proud to say my best friend at the U.S. Attorney's Office put the sheriff of Los Angeles County in jail as part of a corruption investigation that involved, at one part, a bunch of racist sheriff's deputies. But, many other people have what you call unconscious bias, and that's teachers and that's police officers and others, where it's a form of fear and they don't realize it's going on. And so I'm a big proponent, and that same friend, by the way, now she works for LAPD, and she teaches them about unconscious bias and training and how we can have people who want to do the right thing equipped in the right way to understand before that trigger gets pulled, so to speak, with the, that's it, you're suspended, before in real life a real trigger gets pulled by a police officer, to identify and understand that problem and to think more deeply about it. So I think it's a great point I haven't ever thought of until you said it, that unconscious bias should be a feature of not only police officer training, but also educational training to the extent it isn't already. And so to the extent we need public funds to support that, I'd be all for that, because that's important. The third piece, I promised three, even though it's been a long answer. The third piece is something that is probably a little controversial, but I believe, again, as a federal prosecutor who used to take on drug crimes, I prosecuted international drug cartels. I don't know if anybody saw Narcos, but Narcos season 3 is about a case that I investigated. I believe in the legalization of marijuana at the federal level. And one of the main reasons I believe in that, and I believe in it for a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons is I think it is all too common in my lived experience that a white guy who looks like me, has a messenger bag full of weed, walking right down the street in Brooklyn, smoking a spliff, and nobody bothers him. And then there's a kid in the Bronx who's black, and he's doing the same thing, and he ends up in Rikers and starts a lifetime of criminal justice that has a one-way outcome. Because then it's harder to get a job, I think, as Roosevelt pointed out. And so I think we need to legalize marijuana at the federal level, in part because I think it drives very unequal criminal justice outcomes. And it's something that doesn't need to be treated with the criminal justice system. We should be regulating its quality so kids aren't getting sick from vaping. We should be getting tax revenue from the legal and licensed use of it. And we should be taking that money and giving it to American growers and farmers in urban communities and in Montana, and not giving it to drug murderers in Mexico. So I think that's a piece of it for me too.